Hello, everyone. Welcome to the new episode of the Compliance Playbook. A lot of times, if you are a SaaS founder and when you're starting, you always think about that how you can be more secure so that clients start trusting you. And the one major thing that comes to your mind, let's get SOC 2 certified. But what is SOC 2? What exactly does? Who are the players, those who get involved when you talk about the SOC 2? These questions have many more questions around it. So let's try to break down all these nuances to understand the deep dive of SOC. So today we have got Upendra Varma. He's founder of ComplyJet. They help companies to get SOC 2 certified. Today he's with us. He will explain us that what all you need to understand if you are a SaaS company trying to get SOC 2, trying to earn that trust so that clients start respecting you, start trusting you, and start working with you. So let's start it. Hi, Upendra. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey Manoj, excited to chat with you here. I think before we start, right? So I think you were talking a lot about SOC 2 certification, right? But the reality is there is nothing called SOC 2 certification. It's actually a SOC 2 attestation, right? I think let's start from there, what it really means. Basically, there is no certificate, something like that you get as you basically go through this process of SOC 2. So what happens is, as a company, you put in a bunch of internal controls, and we'll talk about what this really means. And you involve an external auditor who's recognized by AICPA. That's the equivalent of our CA firms in the US. That's the international body which has prescribed SOC 2. And they essentially validate all of your internal controls, ensure that you're doing enough things so that they are being followed properly. And at the end of it all, they give you an attestation. So they give you a long 50-page PDF where they say, okay, everything that you're talking about, all the internal controls that you've put in, are in a good shape. We've ensured that we did our basic validation, and then they give you a report. So essentially, it's not a certification, and it's an attestation.
Yeah, I think thank you so much, Upendra. I think that's the reason why we need experts rather than just going to the Chat GPT and Google reading about the things. So I think again, so in the today's age, when there's a AI, people keep going to Chat GPT, people keep going to Google, and I think you started with a very basic thing. It's not the certification, it's the attestation. So Upendra, can you help me to break down the basic difference between the certification is something you get a certification one page that you can hang on your wall. Now you are saying this is not a certification. So how would I go to someone and tell them, okay, I had done my SOC 2, I am attested. So should I send my 50 pages documentation, or how does it, like, what do the basics look like?
Correct. It's something on those lines, right? So what happens is, what you're saying is like, look, we have put in some, as a company, you're voluntarily saying that, okay, we've ensured that enough security controls are put in place. We have ensured that a lot of things are secure, right? And then you voluntarily go to a audit firm, say, hey, can you validate all of these things for me? And they'll just do that exact validation, and then they give you that report. So now, as a customer, you can go out and claim, and you can put this SOC 2 badge on your website. That's completely allowed till 12 months after that auditor gives you that report. But going forward, you're not supposed to technically display this SOC 2 report publicly. Like you don't get to do that, because it contains a lot of confidential information in terms of how your systems are, how your architecture looks like, where you're encrypting, a lot of these things, right? So that's something that you definitely don't want to share publicly, right? So what you typically do is, like, if you are in an advanced conversation with one of your customer, right, and they want to validate your SOC 2 before they close that deal, that's when you sign an NDA with that particular client or customer, and then you share the report, right? So that's why if you go and Google something called SOC 2 report, you will not even find like one report. But if you want to really look at SOC 2 reports, you go, let's say you're using HubSpot, right? Go to the Trust Center. You're using Asana, go to the Trust Center. Put in your email. They'll ensure, if you are a paid customer of them, they will give you a report under your name or under your bookmarked with your brand. It's effectively disallowing you to basically distribute it, right? So that's how the report sharing works. That's on the SOC 2 side of things. But there's something called SOC 3, which is what this is all about. So in the sense that,
Now, so Upendra, I'll come to the SOC 3, but I think specifically for the trust center part, I really want to break it down for all the viewers. So those who are new to this, the world of security, trust center is nothing but it's a library of your documents that you want to publish publicly. And eventually you can also decide that the document might be visible publicly, but might not be accessible publicly. And you call it a trust center. The documents that people can look at so that they can trust you. This is where you publish all your reports. This is where you publish all your certificates, your artist, like Upendra said, for SOC 2 and other things. Now, Upendra, because you're talking about SOC 3, I first want to understand what is full form of SOC.
yeah. So I think it's basically like you can Google it. It's called like Service Organization Controls sort of report. So essentially, AICPA has come up with bunch of sort of reports or criteria. Like there is like SOC 1, there is SOC 2, and SOC 3. Right at the core of it, SOC 1 is something that you would it's mostly related to your financial controls, how you are handling all of that. Right, mostly unrelated to security as such. SOC 2 is primarily focused on your security controls, how you're following them, and all of that. SOC 3 is basically the public data. Like you take your SOC 2 and whatever you can expose publicly, right? Nothing, no information about your company, how your architecture looks, or what the controls you put in. So essentially, SOC 3 is that 1 or 2 pager, a summary of SOC 2 that you can publicly go out and share. So you'll find SOC 3 reports everywhere. So that's how the three things are. So if you are if you are a software company, if you are somebody that you're trying to prove your security, you should be more interested in SOC because that's the one that's relevant for you.
So SOC 1 is your financial thing, SOC 2 is your technology related thing, cloud related thing, and SOC 3 is nothing but summary that you can publish in public.
Exactly. Yes.
That's a very clear differentiation for someone who's just trying to understand. Now, Upendra, let's take a step back again. Okay, now we talk about the security. Let's talk about the security triad. When we talk about CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, SOC cover all three because again, it's the technology and the operations part. So does it
Yes.
cover all three or just cover some of them?
AICPA as a firm, right? So they really don't tell you what are the controls that you'll have to implement in a company, right? So let me even talk about what a control is. Control is something, think of it like a guardrail or something that you put in place to ensure that you are secure after putting it, right? For example, you say that all my customer data will be encrypted, right? So that's a control that you put in place as a company. That's an internal control that you put in place. Right? So think of this as a company, you would want to put as many controls that are relevant for you, right? And those are the controls, right? Because we'll come back to these controls again and again in this episode. Yeah. So going back, the question was around trust service criteria. So what AICPA did for SOC 2 is basically they've said that there are a bunch of trust service criteria, right? So they start with security, availability, confidentiality, then, privacy. Right? These are the 5 major ones that you would need. So among these 5, if you are going for a SOC 2 sort of audit, the only one that's compulsory is security. Everything else is optional again, right? So the only thing that you will have to showcase that I'm implementing is the security aspect of it. But what often happens is among the rest of those 4, you will pick whatever is relevant for you, right? For example, if you're a company where availability is critical, which is typically true for most of the SaaS companies, right? So you would also include availability, as part of your core trust service criteria. So for example, if you are operating in a space where privacy is very, very critical, right? So you might end up sort of using privacy as well as you might also include privacy as well among the trust service criteria that you picked for SOC 2. Right? But what often happens is that people just go with security, availability, and confidentiality because those are the 3 primary things that everybody would expect you to have. But again, security is the only one that's really, compulsory from that perspective. But
so, Upendra, I think now that's a curiosity for me because let's say if I'm a SaaS company, why just security and confidentiality and why not integrity? Because if I again try to break it down, integrity is like my quality of my data. No one is playing around with it. What I'm sending, the receiver is receiving the same. Why there is not much emphasis on that, or is it something there's an emphasis, but I'm missing out something?
Correct. So I think it depends on business to business, right? So for example, if you are operating in a field where your processing integrity is very critical, for example, you're doing a big financial transaction, right? And you want to ensure that, it's perfectly handled, right? So maybe you would include something like a processing integrity in there. But for example, for a typical SaaS company dealing with, let's say you're a marketing automation suite, right? So what sort of there isn't much scope for this sort of TSE in there, right? But on the other hand, something like an availability or security, you're definitely expected to do. So what we've seen is basically it entirely depends upon business to business and type of your business, right? So if you are and the kind of data that you're basically processing, right? If it's financial transactions and stuff like that, yes, you will need to include all 5 possibly. Or if you're using some user data end to end and then you see that, privacy is of utmost importance for you, maybe you start including privacy, right? So there is no hard and fast rule, right? It's all about how you view your business and what you think is relevant for you, right? And that's the whole thing about SOC 2. It's completely voluntary and it's not like you get to decide what you really really want to sort of include in your scope.
Yeah. But again, okay, so Upendra, now you're saying that the security is the compulsory part. Remaining four, as a customer or as a owner of the business, I need to decide. But again, if I talk about the human element, when I say human element, because I think as a human, I want to do the least possible. Okay. Then if you'll ask me, I'll just pick up the security and I'll let go, because for me, what's required, because in most of the people, if you talk to, and you would talk to more people than me, that people just want to do SOC 2 because they want more business. They want clients to trust them. They don't care about anything else. And people just want to do bare minimum to get this. Now, when we're talking about getting the bare minimum, I would just get the security and I will leave rest all the four pillars aside. I don't want to do anything else. So is there anything, is there any attestation, or is there anything, any control or any auditor that comes back and asks or trying to deep dive here? Or it's like completely on my wish, I can just do security and leave everything apart?
Yes, so you can absolutely do that, and a lot of companies do like start from there, right? But what happens is you'll have to understand why you're doing this, right? You're not doing it for your auditor, right? You're eventually doing it to grow your business or to ensure that your customer trusts you. So at some point during your sales cycle, you will be asked to share your SOC 2 report, which is why you're trying to do everything in the first place, right?
Correct.
And within your SOC 2 report, it will be clearly mentioned which trust service criteria have you picked for your SOC 2 audit and what are the things that you have done. Now, if you genuinely think that not including those extra four criteria will not make much of a difference, yeah, absolutely don't even include that. But if you think if the industry standard in your sort of industry is to basically include a bunch of them, go ahead and include them, because you will not be surprised at a later stage. So eventually you will have to make your decision based on how your customer is going to basically look at that report, right? So that's exactly how you should view this entire exercise, right? So most of them never ask for you to or even expect you to include privacy, but that's again, it's up to you. Like lots of major companies, they include all five trust service criteria, right? A lot of mid-sized companies typically include at least those three, right, that we talked about, right? But again, your auditor will never ask you what you want, right? So it's again in your hands. What you decide is important for you, and it entirely comes from what your customer is going to ask, right? So it's pretty easy what to include. Just go and look what your customer is expecting out of you, right? And you got the answer for that.
No, I think that's very good knowledge, because yes, I think you are correct. My auditor might not ask, and I might just try to get away with the list done. But let's say if I'm trying to onboard a big enterprise client, he might expect that one extra pillar of the TSC, and that's where I can go wrong. So now I think a follow-up question on that. So let's say I get my software today. I apply for my software today. Only let's say for two pillars. One could be the security, and second is the confidentiality. Let's say a few months down the line, I realize I also need the privacy or any other pillar. So do I need to do the whole thing again, or it's like just an extra appendix, or like how does that part work?
Yeah, I think you would want to like avoid that at any cost, right? So to start with, right? So ensure that you're picking the ones that you need, because even if you have to pick one, right? So you will have to go through the process again, right? You'll have to involve your auditor, because eventually your auditor is the one who is going to give you that report, right? So you'll have to include the auditor, and then they'll have to at least cross check those. And it depends on the auditor how they want to do it. Do they want to reevaluate everything, right? So it depends a lot on, that scenario, because it's more like an edge case that people, even the auditor would not prefer, even you as a company would not want to do it, right? So because you're redoing the process, right? So it's absolutely critical that you don't you should avoid that scenario as much as possible. But again, the process is the same, right? So you just have to go back to your auditor, say that, hey, here are all the controls, and now we've got like a bunch of new controls that we've put in place for this new trust service criteria, and can you just do a re-audit and issue a new report for us, right? So yeah, so the recommendation is don't put yourself in a position where you have to do that.
So answer is yes, but again you have to go through the whole cycle again. So one more thing, Upendra, now because we're talking about the four pillars of the SOC 2, I can understand if there are more pillars involved, the auditing time will vary, because the less pillar, let's say if I'm only trying to do the security part, it might take a couple of weeks or a couple of days or whatsoever. And if I want to do I want to do confidentiality, integrate, it will take me more time. But from the price point of view, and the reason I'm asking, because again, startup founder, most of them, when they're bootstrapped, they're trying to cut the corners already. So does also the price point impact what am I going to cover in my SOC 2, or it's like flat? And I just want to understand the industry norm for this.
Sure, of course, it'll vary, right? Because more, the more principles, like the more core criteria you use, like the more trust service criteria you use, the auditor will have to do more of his work. So definitely the price point will be more than what you would have for just say one, right? So, but what happens typically in the industry is basically a lot of these auditors. So let's say you're starting with security, right? Let's say you've got like 80 controls for security, right? So when you add something like an availability, you will not go for 80 more controls, but it's just like 10, 15 additional controls, right? So only for privacy, it's just like 10, 15 additional controls. So for the core, we'll have around 80, let's say. Or if you include all five, they'll come up to around 120, 130, right? This is for a typical. So you can see how the workload is increasing for an auditor in terms of validation and all. Including one extra, trust service criteria will not make a huge difference in terms of how much they're going to quote for it. But yeah, what will happen is if you want them to do it again, the entire process again, they'll definitely charge you the entire amount. So yeah, it shouldn't matter a lot if you basically like whether it's just one or three or all five. The variance in terms of how they will, even in terms of like how much effort they will have to put in, it won't like double up, for example, right? It's just, it incrementally changes, right? So it's a marginal increment. So you'll obviously be charged for that extra effort that they'll have to put in, right? So, but yeah, that's how it sort of works. So it's not like five works, right? So you include five pillars, now you have to like do five work and the cost is five, right? That's not how it works. It's maybe like it's one, then maybe it's like 1.2, 1.4, something like that.
So what you're suggesting is security has got like almost, the most of the control, almost 70-80% controls are almost there. And then eventually what more pillars we are ready. And that's how it will just keep adding up the time and keep adding up the cost.
Correct. So again, SOC 2 is not prescriptive in the sense that you don't get a list of controls that you'll have to implement, right? So, but that's what ends up happening, right? A lot of your effort or controls go into the security part of it, right? Let's say you're picking availability, right? What exactly is happening in availability? All you have to prove is that, you have, multi-region deployments, or you have ways to recover everything, right? So what you have to prove in availability is very little versus when you pick security, it's just a lot, right? So you're talking about right from board of directors to encryption to firewalls. I mean, there are so many things that you end up covering in a security versus what additional things that you'll have to cover in availability, right? So that's the same for other sort of trust service criteria as well.
Okay. Yeah. I think that makes sense. Upendra, I think we talked about the pillars, and we also talked about if I had to add another pillar, how does it change? Now, let's say today I get my SOC 2 attestation, everything done, the report has been published, and down the line, let's say I add a new line of business, or I add some new technology. Could be anything. Could be a new data center. Could be a new server. Could be a new firewall. So should I wait for my annual attestation, or I just need to go and knock the door again? Hey, auditor, I done something like that. Do you want to come back and audit again? So what's that cycle?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And the answer to it again is it depends on what you ended up changing and what your customers are expecting. And let me sort of explain you a bit more here, right? So let's say in SOC 2, for example, like even SOC 2 has like two types of, I think we'll cover it in a while, right? There's like a type 1 and there's a type 2, irrespective of what it is. But at the core of it, type 1 is a point in time attestation that you are being evaluated for like one single snapshot, whether it's there or not. And type 2 is basically you'll be evaluated over a period of time, right? Let's pick type 2, for example. So what you get in your SOC is basically, let's say you're going for a SOC type 2 attestation, right? And you got that report, right? So it'll be clearly mentioned the start time of your attestation, like start time of your monitoring period and end time of the monitoring period, right? So, and that will be mentioned. And the system description clearly talks about what is the system that was actually evaluated, right? It will include the people that were involved. It will include your core sort of architecture and, core sort of infrastructure that you sort of included, all those things, right? And that will be audited. Now, imagine you added a new line of business completely, which has like it's a completely new product, all of that stuff. Now, and let's say you ended up, you want to sell it to an enterprise customer, right? So, and it's all good. Now you made it to the final stages and then ask, are you SOC 2 ready? You will say, yes, I'm SOC 2 ready. Then ask, like, give me the report, right? And then when you share the report, they'll see that, okay, your SOC 2 never really included the product that you are actually trying to sell us, right? Because it was never audited in the first place. Now start from there. If they're going to say that, then you will need a reattestation, right? But if it's a marginal increment, for example, you just ended up migrating your database from one place to another, it's okay. They'll not mind because you're clearly telling that this attestation this sort of monitoring period happened 6 months back and we're going to do it again. So they'll not mind minor changes because that happens all the time, right? So it entirely depends on what structural changes your company has undergone through and whether your customers will look at the SOC 2 report that you're sharing and whether they'll be convinced or not. So I think since it's voluntary, it's a good thing as well. You clearly know whether you have to go for it or not based on what you're selling, what you included in your last SOC 2 report and all of that stuff.
Thanks for breaking it down. And I think those who own a SaaS business make note of this, that this is a voluntary thing. And if there is a marginal increment, you are the better judge that if you need the reattestation or you just need to pass it on and wait for your daily attestation. Now, because again, we are talking about the whole attestation part, please also help to understand who are the players involved. Let's say if I'm the founder today, I run a company, I want to get the SOC 2. Who are the players involved? Who I need to reach out, and what does the process and high level process looks like?
Yeah, I think at the core of it, it's super simple, right? So you have to implement a bunch of controls. We talked a bit about that, right? So you have to implement a bunch of controls in your company, ensure that they are working, right? And then you have to include one person called like the auditor. It's a firm, right? It should be a licensed CPA firm that's licensed in the US. You have to figure out one such firm, talk to them, show all the controls that you've implemented, and show them the proof that this is how this control is working. For example, if your control is okay, all my customer data is encrypted, prove how you're doing that, right? So your auditor will validate that, and then they'll give you the report. So there is nobody else involved. It's actually super simple at the core of it. You have to implement a bunch of controls and prove that. Pick an auditor, licensed auditor, and prove that you're implementing it. They'll look at it, they'll give you the report, right? That's exactly how it is. But now this is not how it ends up happening in a real life scenario, because you don't even know what controls you have to implement, right? So it's a lot of that process, right? How do you pick the right controls for you? How do you figure out sort of the right evidence, right? How do you even prove that you're implementing a particular control? What sort of proofs do you need? And the second part is, where do you pick the right auditor, right? How do you work with them, right? So what, like, there'll be a lot of back and forth. So at the core of it, it's pretty simple, but that might not be the recommended way for you if you are, for example, trying to do it for the first time, right? Or if you don't have an InfoSec person sitting in your company, right? So if you don't want to spend 6 months doing this back and forth with an auditor, right? So there are better ways of doing it, but at the core of it, like, everything else is optional. You just need one auditor, right? And you can directly give him the proof, right? And then if he's satisfied with it, he'll issue a report. Everything else is just optional for you, right?
Got it. So, Upendra, now I think there are a lot of questions that you have opened up here. First one, how to reach out to this auditor? Let's say if I'm the company and I'm super confident that I have implemented all the controls, how can I reach to how can I reach to the CPA? How can I reach to the auditor? What is the process?
Yeah, I think that's a tough question, because last time I checked, there were around 30,000-40,000 licensed CPA firms. And I don't know how many licensed CPA individuals. There might be like huge, and anybody can do that for you, right? But what you'll have to really understand is, basically, just because a firm is licensed, it doesn't mean they have the expertise to do it. So not every CPA firm has that sort of expertise and understanding to, even though they can issue a SOC 2 report legally, right? But if they don't understand what SOC 2 is, right? So if they haven't done it for hundreds of customers previously, right, they will not do it for you first, like in the first place. But even if you end up convincing them, it'll just be, a lot of back and forth figuring out what to do, what not to do, right? And there's also a third angle, wherein if your CPA firm is not well known to your customers, maybe they might also start asking questions, even though that happens a bit rarely, right? So ideally, what you would want to do is to figure out somebody who has that expertise, right? So who has already, who's sort of issuing SOC reports, who's been doing this for a while, right? And then maybe you want to engage with them, and then you essentially start this process. Now, how do you find them? I think it all depends, right? So it's like any other job for you, right? How do you find a lawyer for your company, right? So how do you find? Yeah. So it's the same process. If somebody tells you that, hey, this guy does it nice, maybe you start from there, or you just simply search on the Google. Like, you can do it however you want, but the idea is, like, figure out somebody who has done it before, so that you end up saving a lot of time, right? So that they don't have to, like, do it for the first time, which will end up saving a lot of your time. But yes, it's very, very hard in general, right? And there's one more thing as well. All these CPA firms and all these CPAs, they are essentially CAs, right? So what do they even understand about a technical control like encryption?
Yeah.
That's the sad part about it, right? So because eventually the auditor who's auditing, most of them have zero knowledge about how all of these things work, right? Which is good or bad at the same time, because yeah, definitely bad overall, but right. But yeah. So what you'll have to really understand is, basically, it's important that they not only have done SOC 2 before, but they must have, like, it's preferable if you can find someone who has worked with companies similar to you. For example, if you're based on cloud, all the controls will look very, very different to a company which is basically, running on-prem, right? So you would preferably, it's recommended you find an auditor who's done that, who's done that audit for a company like you who's on cloud, because they at least understand a bit about who controls encryption, for example, right? How firewalls exist, right? So otherwise you're just educating them, okay, like, firewalls will be implemented by AWS, I'm just using the configuration, right? So that itself will take you a lot of time to explain and do a back and forth, right? So So yeah, that's how the summary is basically.
Got it, got it. So I think though on the core it looks very, very simple that I am the founder, I reach out to a CPA, get it done. But the step one is who is the right CPA? Then eventually, I think also you mentioned that what kind of business he has audited in the past and how much understanding does he have. So I think these are the couple of layers that makes it more complicated. And I think that's where consultants or the companies like ComplyJet come into the picture. So Upendra, though I don't want to promote ComplyJet right now, but I really want to understand at the core what Upendra or what ComplyJet knows that can make my life simple as a founder.
Yeah, I think like I don't even want to talk about us for now, right? But I think what I'll tell you is basically, as we've talked about the core process, right? Which is basically you putting in a bunch of controls and trying to figure out the right evidence that you've put in put in for each of these controls so that your auditor can approve it. That's the core part that you want to solve, right? So how can you do it, right? So obviously there are different ways. If you're a larger company, the best way to do is to just build an in-house team, right? Build an information security and compliance team who understands what these are in the first place, right? So who can go and build those 80, 100, 150 controls that are relevant for your company, right? And they can drive all this process. They can implement all these controls. They can figure out how to gather evidence. They can do the back forth with your auditor and all of that, right? That's, I would say, the ideal way of sort of doing things because they have the expertise. You have an in-house team, so you can nicely customize and they can do that thing with the auditor as well, right? But often what ends up happening is, it might not be the smartest way of doing it, right? You don't want to hire a 10% compliance team to just get that SOC2 certification, especially if you are starting early or you're not there yet, right? Or if you're not a public company or if you don't have like 300% team, right? Maybe you don't want to invest directly in that, right? But that's what you should eventually aim to get there, right? So, but now what can you do before that, right? What if you don't have a compliance team in-house, right? What are you going to do about it, right? Because as an engineering head or as a CTO, right? So it's not really recommended that you go and learn about all these things and implement it because your job is to build your product or refine your service. That's your core job. Your core job is not to understand what SOC 2 means or how you can do it, right? So the recommendation there is to basically bring in some sort of expert or like work with an expert possibly, right, who understands this, right? So essentially an external consultant or someone who's been doing this for a while who can sort of help you guide in the right direction, right? That's a great way of doing things as well. And that's how most of the early stage companies like sort of used to do, till a few years back, right? Because an external consultant would come in, like he'll put all the controls for you, he'll help you gather the right evidence, and then he'll ensure that you're audited and all of that, right? And then you get it, right? But the problem with it is a lot of these things, right, they are still manual, right? So he'll have to talk to all of you guys. You have to figure out, for example, let's say, let's go back to our encryption control again, right? Just to prove that you're encrypting your customer data, he'll have to talk to your engineering head, right? He'll have to talk to your DevOps person, right? He'll have to talk to everybody who has some understanding of your where data is sitting, and then he'll have to figure out where that data is and how you are actually encrypting it, right? So it'll be a lot of back and forth, and then eventually he might end up taking a bunch of screenshots here and there proving that you are implementing the controls properly and all of it, right? So again, that's the second way of doing things. The problem with that again is you'll end up spending at least few months to even get ready, right? Even before the audits, right? Again, then what ended up happening is there are like a lot of these new age compliance automation platforms, like among which ComplyJet is also one such platform, right? Which are tailor-made specifically for a certain set of companies, right? So all these compliance automation tools that you listen to, they don't work for everyone, right? So they are built for a certain type of companies, assuming a lot of things. For example, if you're a new age tech company, most likely, right, you are hosted on AWS or Azure or GCP, right? Yeah. Now everything changes if you are on one of these three cloud providers, because now if your data is on AWS, it's pretty easy to prove that you're encrypted, right? Most likely your data is on like you're using some RDS database and you are storing using S3 for your static data, right? So I can directly look at the configurations of your RDS and simply check whether you've enabled that configuration check or not, encryption check or not. I can do something similar for S3, right? So a simple API code which can basically directly interact with AWS can give me that evidence, right? So just by integrating your cloud stack with a lot of with these automation tools, they automatically pull in all that information, and then they are instantly able to generate that evidence for you, right? Which was taking months and months. They can do it within seconds, right? Because all you need to do is like a bunch of API calls, whether you're doing it or not, right? So what changed is something that was taking months will now take you like, at least a few seconds to gather the evidence. And obviously you're not doing it right, maybe a few days here and there to basically fix it. Or if you have like a large infrastructure footprint, or you've done something very, very bad, maybe you want to revamp all of your architecture, you might end up doing that. That completely depends upon where you are as a company. But but the idea is the evidence gathering happens instantaneously, right? So you end up saving months and months altogether by using one of these tools, right? But you have to really understand these work only if you're on AWS, for example, or maybe one of those popular public cloud providers, right? Because this can't happen if you are, hosting on-prem, or if you're using some weird service that nobody knows or understands about, right? Because they're never going to build an integration for you, right? So that's the smartest way, I believe, to do things, among which ComplyJet is also trying to do something similar, right? And a lot of these platforms do that because you can get to that process much, much faster, right? So that's the way to think about it. But again, you have to really understand it only works if you are a company who's using standard stack, right? And you're on one of these public clouds. Maybe you're using something like a GitHub or GitLab to host your code, or you're on Google Workspace, or like a bunch of standard sort of, because nobody will build integrations for other things that you might. That's this new way of doing compliance or SOC2 that you might have heard about, right? Yes.
Yes. So I think what you mentioned about bringing in the consultants is not just saving me money, but also saving me a lot of efforts, because I think companies like ComplyJet or this external consultant, because they have done this before, they understand the nuances, they understand how do things work. So at the initial level, like I cannot forget 10 compliance. I cannot even hire one compliance guy, because coming from the background, I know it's very, very expensive to hire a compliance guy. So I think that's where, the consultants or the freelancers, those who have been there, have done that, can do a lot of help. One specific thing that we talked about, and I think this is going to help a lot of SaaS founders. You talked about that if you're on a cloud, probably on AWS or GCP, that becomes easy. Can you quantify how easy? Let me compare. If I'm a SaaS company on-prem, which is like probably none as of today, and that if there's someone ideally, that could be probably they might be in the banking or something. But if I compare someone who is on the prem and someone who's on the SaaS, how much ready I am if I'm on if I'm on the AWS? Can I say I am 50% more ready or 80% more ready? What could be the difference?
So it entirely depends upon who built sort of. I think readiness is something that depends upon how you ended up like spinning the infrastructure, right? For example, like when I was trying to, for example, ComplyJet is on AWS, right? So when we started, right? So and we have pretty basic stack. We use RDS, we use S3, the usual stuff like top 10, 12 managed services as such, right? So when we were starting, since I knew what it means to be compliant, right? So when I was spinning a production RDS instance, I ensured that things like, the encryption is there, the backups are there, right? The right set of monitoring is in place. So when we decided to go for SOC 2, it took me like 10-15 minutes, because everything else was like already compliant, because I knew what I had to do, right? If a lot of people sort of, building this infrastructure for the first time know what they need to do, they're actually like 90, 95, even 100% ready on day one as such, right? So I think what AWS does, like not just AWS, it's like any other public cloud platform. What it does is basically it gives you all the right configurations and the right things so that you can be compliant from day one, right? It's just that you have to know what are those things that you'll need to configure on day one, right? So that you can get compliant. But let me talk about some other company, right? There's a recent customer of ours, like, who's on AWS, right? So I was just basically, reviewing their infrastructure recently. When we basically plugged in, right? When we started pulling in data, they were almost around 60-70% compliant, right? So because it was pretty purely from an infrastructure perspective, right? So compliance, there are like 10 other things, but we're just talking about the infrastructure readiness in general, right? So there they had things like encryption, backups, because everybody understands these things, right? So you would naturally ensure that, yes, I would deploy my database, I would have multiple availability zones in place, and ensure that the encryption is there. And when you're creating it for the first time, you just naturally tick for a production system. But they didn't really have something like monitoring. For example, as part of SOC 2, like you have to monitor all of your key critical infrastructure systems, right? So you need to set up alerts if your CPU is, like above 90%, for example, right? Naturally, you will have to do it outside of, it's a separate exercise that you typically end up doing, but they wouldn't have done it. Like, and nobody does it on first, when you're doing it for the first time, right? So they had to put those monitoring controls in place, right? So that took them like few hours here and there to just ensure that they, right? So yeah, I think it depends. And especially if you're starting early, and if you are using one of these major cloud providers, like, and if you're serious about it, I've seen people get everything done in like a day, right? Because if you have like maybe 10-15 key resources, right? Maybe a few databases here, 5-10 buckets, storage buckets, and then you have like bunch of EC2 instances. It's not, you don't end up doing a lot of things, right? Because so, and you can actually get there in a a day or two if you are serious about it from an infrastructure readiness perspective, right? So that's what we've seen.
Got it.
And the key part that's happening is like once you are there, you don't have to gather any new evidence, right? The evidence gathering is automatically happening through one of these platforms because they've built API sort of integrations. So that part is like basically zero work for you, which is huge if you have to work with a consultant or if you have to do all of this process manually.
Got it. Got it. If I'm a SaaS company hosted on AWS or Azure or a GCP, how ready I am compared to if I am on-prem? How much how less time it will take me to become the SOC 2 ready? Just quantify it for me.
Depends on infrastructure footprint. I think I'll just call it something like this. So if you have, let's say, 20-30 key resources, you should be getting there in like 2 or 3 days if you're serious about it.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think this will bring a smile to a lot of SaaS founders that at least I'll be ready in 2 to 3 days if we are on AWS, Azure, or GCP. Nice. So Upendra, before we proceed towards the end part, what is that one thing that you want to tell to the new SaaS founders who are still struggling to understand the compliance and trying to run away, not understanding that the more time they will take to delay the process, they are just delaying their sales and nothing else. What do you want to tell them?
Yeah, I think I'll give an anti-advice. Like basically don't get into this compliance, SOC 2, all of it unless you really have to, right? Like things can happen very fast, but as a founder, your goal is to, ensure that you're building a good business, right? Security is very, very critical. I know you'll be investing in it, but that might not be your top priority. If you are somebody who's trying to sell your product or SaaS product to any decently sized mid-market enterprise, or even these days early stage companies as well, if you're bringing in their critical data, you will be asked for security assurances, and SOC 2 is the way to go, and you just can't avoid it. Right? So what I feel is deep down, when is the right time to invest in it, right? So, and as a founder, you will definitely know it. If 10 sales calls, you will know if you need SOC 2 or not, right? You know the answer you need or not, right? You have to figure out when to do it. And I feel if you think you need it, you should just invest in it right away, right? Because in this age, it's not at all hard to get that, not at all hard, or it's not time taking to get ready and then maybe get to a type 1 and then get to a type 2, right? So yeah, but don't do it just because everybody else is doing it. Do it because you know you have to do it.
So don't do it for the FOMO. Do it because you need it. Thank you so much, Upendra. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, taking out the time on the Sunday morning so that we could record this and so we could understand for all the SaaS founders, those who you know and those who I know. And I think we'll keep coming back to you for more because I think SOC 2 or the compliance is not something that I can really wind up in a 30-40 minutes discussion because people have been talking about the books have been written or there are so many blogs written out there. So Upendra, let's do it one more time probably in some coming months. But until then, thank you so much. Thanks for your time.
Absolutely, Manoj. It was lovely talking to you and hope I might have added some value to all of your audience.